Well, it's impossible to talk about plate tectonics and earthquakes and volcanoes in only 20 minutes. So I asked myself, what am I going to tell? I mean, there's so many things to be told about all these features. So I'll just pick out a couple of things. And who am I? Well, I was already introduced by Roel, so I won't overdo that again. But here I am with Roel together on Groenland. We know each other from a long time ago already, and we went several times to Iceland together. And it was always great news for me, because then he was just doing the story and I could organize all the trip. That was very easy. If you just start the rule, here, you're there, this is an outcrop, tell the story, then, well, you have 20 minutes break, at least. That's fine for me. So I met him there, and it's been a pleasure to work with him always. Well, there's always the question, why are there so many things happening in so short term sometimes? The planet seems dead in a sense that there's not so much happening during a lifespan, maybe in a couple of years. And well, it's one of the first ideas in geology that was at Siccar Point. This is a very famous geological point in Scotland, where there was the first realization, so things that happened in the past are still working today, and it took an enormous amount of time to create things like this, with a cross-bedded discordancy. I hope you all know what that is, and if not, then you'll go to the courses of Roel once again. So this is very common, that there's very slow processes operating at our planet, but finally they get shape in rocks, and they have some, you can see them, you can notify them. So there's very slow changes always. But on the other hand, there is big changes happening as well, big events. Why there are no dinosaurs anymore? Well, that's one big comet that hit the Earth 65 million years ago. There have been supervolcanoes. There has been a big flood. Well, I don't know if that's true, but well, I just put it there. I mean, there have been events that changed the world. And we all realized that we never really experienced these really large events. We didn't experience them. We study them, there's nice movies about them, but we didn't witness them yet. So there's the key question, are we going to experience one in our lifetime, or aren't we? As a geologist, I would like to. As a parent, I would not like to. That's always a bit of a mixed feeling as a geologist. So, well, let's have at least a look at for example, all the damage that's occurring due to all these disasters. Because it's costing more and more to our civilization that there's big earthquakes happening. Well, you already talked, yesterday there was some talks about climate. So in general, the climate disasters really are increasing a lot in amount of money they cost. But, well, a big earthquake like in Japan is quite costly as well. If that would happen every year in Japan, Japan could not pay for that. So that's quite important to realize that at the end, the losses are increasing much more than the national product we gain in all the countries. So here in Wageningen you're safe, of course, but in Amsterdam I live in Hilversum, just to be sure. But it's a bad idea, that's one of the topics of Vellinga, Professor Vellinga. It's a bad idea to keep investing in the western part of the Netherlands, which will be drowned anyway in 50 years, isn't it? So you should think about these things. So why can't we predict any earthquake? That would be great, huh? So for example, this Himalaya, Nepal earthquake, which happened and was taped by many people and experienced and witnessed, we can just study it. We can study the deformation, the displacement of the Earth that happened by the quake itself, the boundary between two plates slipping at a certain stage. And we can study that one. And we can just say, well, it happened. But then, of course, we already knew that earthquakes are happening there, because otherwise you will never build a Himalaya like this. You need a lot of earthquakes to create a mountain range like this. So it's common sense for a geologist that there must be earthquakes happening at the border between Eurasia and India. That's the way it goes. So if you look at, for example, this Himalayan front, the contact between the two plates slips sometimes at certain points, but it doesn't break all the way. It's a contact between two plates, and the tension is increasing, so there's stored energy, and at a certain stage the energy will be released by a slip along a fault surface, a big fault surface. And we can even calculate what parts of the contact between the plates are likely to rupture and what will happen, how much stored energy there is present at that point of the plate contact. So for example, if you look at the place near Kathmandu where the earthquake happened, we know that it happened some couple of years, 100 years ago. And all of a sudden there seems to be a pattern that every segment is rupturing once every 700 years, 500 years, in that order of magnitude. So when I see people that were really touched by all the images we saw from Kathmandu and helping to, well, there was a lot of money going to Kathmandu to rebuild all sorts of buildings and rebuild them earthquake-proof, then I would say, well, you'd better make the buildings earthquake-proof next to Kathmandu, because that will be the next section to rupture. And Kathmandu, you still have some couple of 100 years before there will be a next large earthquake occurring, most likely. So in a sense that it's, if you think in this, well, again, timescales, I guess that Salomon Kronenberg yesterday talked about the human timescale and the geological timescale. Here, again, that's an important thing to realize. So, for example, there's always the difficulty of forecasting or predicting. That's a different thing. Forecasting is that you just, well, try to at least give an idea in general about what might happen, and that's what the geologist can do most often. For example, San Francisco, waiting for the next big one. There's every couple of 100 years, more or less, a big earthquake occurring there, but the last big one was already in 1906, so the next one should have been here already. But hey, it's not that simple. So there's the difference between prediction, and it's always funny because after every earthquake there will be people that say, I predicted it. Look, I already wrote it down, and it's here up there with the bridge, the Golden Gate Bridge. There will always be people that say, I predicted this earthquake. But they predict earthquakes every day. So then finally, one time, you're right. But predicting an earthquake is impossible still. What we can do, at least, is forecasting one. And that's a bit related just as the Dutch system of thinking about flooding that changed from an event once in the 10,000 year to a percentage by now, more or less. So much chance of having an earthquake in, for example, the San Francisco area in this region, along this fault. And that's depicted by the other figure. So that's always a very difficult geological dilemma. It's always, on the one side, you can say, well, every earthquake happens within 3 months of an equinox, and you're right. But it doesn't tell you anything. So it's very general, and there's no way of dealing. And if you want to prepare people for that, you didn't say where, you didn't say exactly when, so you will have to protect all civilization, and it will cost far too much money. And on the other side of the spectrum is, of course, to say very specifically, tomorrow at 3 o'clock, everybody in San Francisco should go out of the house, because there will be a major earthquake occurring, which is impossible. But that's exactly what managers and mayors and presidents want from earth scientists in general. They want a very strict prediction. How much chance do I have? Do I have to take measurements? How much will it cost? And will the cost be worthwhile? Or, well, do we invest a lot of money in something which we will never be sure whether it was required after all? Maybe we'll have to ask our grandchildren whether it was smart to rebuild the Netherlands in Wageningen, for example. It's the same thing. So then you can think of, for example, the probability. So the probability of an event to occur, so an earthquake, there will be an earthquake or there won't be an earthquake, so that's made. If you throw a die, then that's easy. You can think of throwing 6. And you've got 6 possibilities and one of the 6 is right, so that's the chance of throwing a 6. One of my colleagues says, no, it's 50% because you either throw it or not, but that's he's a bit lousy in statistics. So if you think of the total possible results of an earthquake, for example, occurring, then that's related to the time there is in between the earthquakes. So if you improve the information about the recurrence time interval, so the time interval between the earthquakes, if you improve the knowledge about this, we might be able to make a better prediction or say something more about the probability of an earthquake to occur. So the past is, as we always say, the key to the future. And we already know this, but I mean, for example, sand volcanoes that occurred in Christchurch, I was just talking to, also, well, you can see easily that there have been earthquakes earlier in an area by just seeing the effects of an earthquake happening now. So this is in Japan, but we can already see in the subsurface of Japan, there have been several big earthquakes that created as well sand volcanoes. Or tsunamis in the low-lying areas of Japan and Sri Lanka and things like that. If you just dig a hole, you will come across sand layers full of coral debris and shells. Totally mixed, chaotic. So that's tsunami deposits. So you can easily count back in time how often these things occur. And then it's even easy to tell that it's, well, quite common to have tsunamis over there. The region of Fukushima, Sendai, was already hit by a big tsunami in 861. I always forget the right number, but more or less in this, so every now and then this can occur. So, as you know, as earth scientists, I guess, we look back in history to say something about future. And on a shorter time scale, the same is valid. I mean, this is the great Japanese wall before the tsunami hit, and this is the not so great anymore Japanese wall after the earthquake. Parts have been destroyed completely, and all along the coast, back and forth. Yeah. Can you still see it? Well, all along the coast, villages were destroyed. Apart, it seems a bit like a graphic novel of Asterix, but there was one village. there was a mayor which experienced a tsunami himself in 1931, and he resisted that the wall protecting his village would be 15.5 meters high, a couple of meters below what was planned originally. And he said, no, I want it higher. Unfortunately, he didn't finally make it to see that his will finally protected all of the village. It was completely saved by his memory, by his personal time scale was enough to save all of the village. And then you can start thinking how much money was put in this effort to save the village, and was it worthwhile? That's very economic. But I think this shows clearly that we need to be very careful in thinking on the human time scale, even in this sense as well. So I showed you dice, but of course an earthquake or a volcano is not random. I mean, just as a flooding can happen every year, because weather meteorology is much more random than earthquakes are. Earthquakes only occur if there's enough stress built up to make a very long slip along a fault. Or a volcano cannot just erupt every couple of days because it needs pressure again to build up and then it can erupt. So it's not as easy as just the probability of throwing dice. And that's, of course, difficult. So how can you transfer this to hazard, then? We got nice pictures of this is a nice map of the seismic hazard of the world. But the strange thing is that this picture is just made by our experience, our very short experience. So it's a bit the same as if I play with my children in a game and they throw dice, and after 5 times they say there's no 6 on it, because they don't throw 6. So we don't know even whether there might be 6 coming, or so predictions are only based on our information, the things we witnessed. And that's intriguing because there have been maps of Haiti, for example, before and after the big earthquake occurring there, that have been changed. The day after the earthquakes, they just took a red pencil and made the red area a bit bigger. Well, that doesn't work. I mean, why is it a hazard map then? And Japan as well, I mean, famous for the earthquakes. The large earthquakes in Japan occurring over the last couple of years were outside of the regions that were depicted red as being dangerous. Because, again, it's only based on our very limited time window that we experience things. And why are they wrong? Well, for example, they're wrong because the model is wrong. For example, up to 1980, there were a couple of data, and then there was about subduction, the idea, well, if you know the rate of convergence between plates. You know how old the plate is that goes down, then you can calculate the maximum size of earthquakes. But it was just based on the knowledge until then, and by now we do have new data points, and all of a sudden that doesn't hold anymore, so the model is wrong. And I will skip the other one. Or we change the model. That's another possibility, of course. Indeed, Groningen, for example, we changed the model. We changed the boundary conditions. So all of a sudden, the model doesn't hold anymore. We have to change our idea about what's possible and what's impossible. Oklahoma as well, you already depicted in the starting. Well, it's tremendous. I mean, Groningen, of course, it's difficult if you live there, but Oklahoma is way above this, with man-made earthquakes up to 5.6 and just going nuts over there. It's happy to not live there, I would say. So then quickly to volcanoes, because there's only limited time, of course. And as well, of course, I have to put in Iceland, because that's always the link. If Roel is mailing me, then first things that pops in my mind is Iceland. So this is Holaround, which was active over, well, quite some time, a couple of months in Iceland. And as we speak, by the way, Katla is really rattling at the moment. There were more than 100 earthquakes since 3 o'clock this afternoon. So there might be news shortly that there's another Icelandic volcano again erupting. Well, was there any problem with Holaround? Well, there was not that much problem. It was nice pictures. The lava didn't emerge under the ice, so there was no explosion. It was just a crack opening, nice fountains coming out. You could just drive over. Perfect. I mean, very, very media, for the media, it was perfect to have all these images. But then it continued and continued, and it just, you can already see the yellowish clouds that come up from it, full of sulfur. And after a couple of months, it produced more sulfur than all of Europe produce in a year. So there was the only problem if this would continue, because it was already noted in Iceland, it was really problematic. In Scotland, it was unhealthy, to say the least, and even in the Netherlands, it was measured. So, do you think? Well, this is the neighboring system, LAKI, and that erupted for over 9 months. So that continuously going, flowing basalts with a lot of sulfur out of it, and that, well, that led to a lot of people dying in Europe, especially in the winter after the eruption. Extra cold, well, even maybe causing famine, so maybe even a link to the French Revolution, which is disputed, but still there were a lot of people suffering from this, really dying from a volcano in Iceland. And even the idea was to take all the people of Iceland off the island, because they would perish anyway. But it did not involve, the Holaround did finally not evolve into a LAKI scenario. Why not? I mean, that's the good question. Why did it stop at a certain stage? Because if it would have happened now, the LAKI eruption, and that's a study, then we would have at least, well, in the Netherlands, especially in the Netherlands and the southern part of England, over 1,000 extra fatalities a year, or even more, due to pulmonary problems. So if that would happen now, we would still have a big issue. Or if it even gets worse. This Yellowstone, the famous story of Yellowstone. Not to scare you off, but one obstacle that we, of course, are facing is that we don't know the precursors. We don't know whether something will lead to a big eruption. So it might be happening at the moment without knowing. Or the rumbling of the Katla today will die off, and everybody will say, well, nothing happened, really. So that's a big thing, because Yellowstone is known to erupt every 600,000 years, more or less, over the last couple of million years. And we're overdue. So, don't be scared. I mean, the chance to witness it is very small, but the impact would be enormous, of course. And there again, the largest eruption we witnessed, and which was studied quite nicely, was the Pinatubo, although we missed the start of it. So we missed all the signs that led to this eruption, because we were too late. There was no measurements installed, it was 91. So that was quite time ago. So, well, 6 we witnessed, but you can get to 8 maybe, or in volcanic explosivity. And that's supposed to be more or less logarithmic as well, so it has to increase enormously to get from 6 to 7. So how do we know something more about history. And there the volcanic ash comes in from the Eyjafjallajökull. I did it. And we all know that this was funny for Iceland because they didn't have cash at that moment, but they had ash. So there's a lot of nice t-shirts you can buy in Iceland. And there was winds coming all the way, all the time, all spring towards us. So we had all this ash coming over us. And planes could not go through the ash cloud, was the idea, because the ash would melt and maybe block the motors. So that would be a very difficult thing. So that seemed to be a problem, not for Iceland, because the ash was not going to their grass fields, which they need to feed the sheep in the winter, but they went all the way to Europe. No problem. So if you look at this ash, it's part of the solution as well. That's funny, because every volcano has a specific chemical sign in the ash. If you analyze it, you can directly say it was that volcano, because it has a different composition than other volcanoes have. So if you look into records of ash layers, for example, in Greenland, or here in the Netherlands as well, or in Norway, we can say that it was this volcano, and it erupted every so much year. So we can get a better picture of how often this volcano will erupt, the recurrence interval, again, between the volcanoes. So that's great news, because then we can more or less get a bit more understanding how long it takes before big eruptions occur. And while we study all sorts of things by now, small earthquakes happening under a volcano, the amount of magma, of fluids under a volcano, we do know this under Merapi. We know how much it more or less is. We can see that magma is on the move, which is not the case at Katla till now. There's very low frequency earthquakes, tremor, and we can detect it, and that's magma which is making its way to somewhere else. We can measure all sorts of gases and temperature. And I recall Roel doing this in Iceland as well, putting his thermometer everywhere where there was steam coming out of the rocks. And then we made a poll, trying to figure out how hot it would be. That was nice. So I redid it another time. There you can see me. Or deformation of the volcanoes with GPS, or even by now by radar. That can detect whether the volcano is still inflating or it's deflating already. So whether there's still an eruption to follow or whether the eruption is waning. And that was what happened, for example, with Eyjafjallajökull as well. There were a couple of radar images of 95 and 99, and all of a sudden the volcano was inflating, but nothing really happened. Small earthquakes occurred, nothing really happened. And it stayed quiet until about 10 years later. All of a sudden. So that's still very intriguing. I think that's very intriguing to still have a picture. Although we get so much information by now, it's all live. You can all see all earthquakes coming in. Like I told you today, it's just coming through Twitter. People standing in front of the eruption. You can just ask them, how is it looking like there? I mean, what's happening? Tell me. And they will. So we see all sorts of eruptions going on, for example, but we don't know whether this is really going to the next phase, or it might not. If I will be asked the next time if Katla will start erupting today, and I might be asked to say something on the media about it, and I will say, well, I don't know. So what's a geologist in use? I mean, he doesn't know. And that's a bit silly. So at least we try as well to deal with of course, with the dangers that might be there by, well, if an eruption would happen, then what happens? So making models of what would happen with the lava flow in for example, near Reykjavik, or pyroclastic clouds coming down, then at least you know where you shouldn't be if there's a volcano starting to erupt, and where you can still stay safe. So I think that's finally the end of what I wanted to tell, that there's predictions possible. No. A forecast, more in general, like the weather, yes. And this is a very famous quote, it's hard to predict an earthquake, especially before it happens. And there's the die with 7 on it, because we still don't know what 6, maybe we experience 6, but maybe 7 is possible, and 8 as well, we don't know yet. So we still need a lot of disasters and non-disasters, things that seem to become a disaster but don't, finally, evolve into a disaster, to be much more sure about what's leading to an eruption or an earthquake, and what will not be leading to something like that. So the present is the key that doesn't always fit yet. We still need time.